We're just going to move right into our next session. We have a kind of delightful special session, and I am going to invite Mark MacDonald from Ernst & Young to introduce him. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ed, and good morning to everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce two very esteemed individuals in the world of innovation policy. Obviously, the current minister and a former minister of industry amongst his other portfolios. As we're here today to discuss, Canada obviously faces many innovation challenges. And today's panel will talk about one dimension, perhaps a couple, but an important one, and that has to do with the role of government and specifically government policy, the various policy instruments that are being emphasized for the promotion of innovation and obviously for the continued promotion of economic growth. And it is my pleasure now to have the Minister Bains and John Manley have a 15-minute or so conversation amongst themselves, and while they're doing that, please think of questions because there will be that opportunity afterwards. Gentlemen.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Minister, may I call you Minister?
I think Navdeep is fine.
Okay. I have to ask you a question. I mean, we had a lot of heavy conversation here this morning already. When I was in the House of Commons, we weren't allowed to wear headgear.
Correct.
Like, what is it with this?
This thing
has
called
the world really changed?
Well, it's 2016, as the Prime Minister would say. But you know, I have a few turban jokes that I use time to time, and I can get away with it. But I also help communicate the government's message. So I remember when we had the speech from the throne, I had a really bright turban to reflect sunny ways, yes. Right? So that was one theme that we wanted to convey, so it's very helpful. I think Kate Purchase in the PMO's office for Director of Comms is very happy when I do that. And then I think last week I wore a green turban when we put a price on pollution. And so, yeah, I do take advantage of the different colors of turbans that I do have and try to get some of the government messages across.
Well, that's really fascinating that you're using it as messaging because...
I'm not sure that's what my forefathers thought, though.
Have you ever thought about actually, you know, using text? let me show you what I mean. Because this is becoming quite common. I mean,
innovate again. So
there you go.
So you're inspired by Donald, I think.
Let's just get our messages across. But let's talk about innovation. I mean, yes. and truthfully, maybe had I done my job 25 years ago, we wouldn't still be talking about it. But anyway,
no, I wouldn't be so hard on yourself. In the CD Howe building, you're still very well regarded. They've got a couple of rooms named after you still. That's always a good sign. But a lot of the work
that we used to call them John.
But I won't go down that path. But no, a lot of the work that we're building on right now is based on a strong foundation, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. So thank you for the work that you've done in the past, and you shouldn't be so hard on yourself.
So, well, I try to be easier than others are, so just to make it, it's always humbling to go home. But you've come out of now a period, I think we counted 6 different branches to the consultation around the innovation agenda. Yeah. Are you now at the point of saying, here are, you know, maybe 2 or 3 of our top priorities coming out of that?
Yeah, you're correct. I mean, when we went out there, we made it very clear that the government doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas and that we genuinely need to engage Canadians. And it's not engagement for the sake of engagement, but it's really based on the premise that if you have people involved in the process, they become ambassadors. And it's really trying to create that culture of innovation that we wanted to also focus on. And so when you have people out there engaged in the process, because innovation means different things to different people, and so we wanted to kind of narrow the conversation, and we created a framework of 6 different themes, as you alluded to. But as the conversations unfolded over the past few months, it became very evident that 3 things stood out. That from those 6, actually, there's 3 themes that stood out. The first is no matter whatever conversation I had, if it was with government or with business or the different roundtables that we had, the number one issue in terms of our overall economic agenda, in terms of the government's innovation agenda, was talent. That you can build all the buildings, you can have all the policies, but without talent, without the right people, that's the key ingredient. So that theme became very evident, that if we want to have a successful innovation agenda, a successful growth agenda, if we want to create good quality jobs, that talent should be our number one focus. And so there's a lot I can talk to you about that if you like as well. The other area that came out was the desire for us to, as a government to work with private sector on emerging technologies and saying, look, those technologies are disrupting many different industries and all industries. So it's not just one or two industries. Disruption is taking place across the economy in different sectors. And what role can government play to help really build on those emerging technologies? How do we take a leadership role on maybe 2 or 3 areas where we can focus on? And so that was one area that became very evident as well. So people in technology and really creating an environment for technologies to flourish. And also the last thing that came up was really around how do we invest in companies and what companies. So generally speaking, and this is at a broad level, in Canada, we do a really good job of starting up companies. But we do a very poor job of identifying the high growth firms and helping them scale up and grow. So the feedback that I received is we want to help companies grow and scale up. And so those would be the 3 themes that stood out. I mean, really around talent, it's about development of talent, attracting talent, and how do we retain it. Around emerging technologies, how do we create an environment to be a global leader in key technologies? And how do we become the jurisdiction if you have a good idea and you want to grow and scale up, what role can government play in that as well? So those are the 3 themes that stood out.
So we heard first thing this morning from Tom Jenkins, who basically said to us, look, invention is turning money into ideas. Innovation is turning ideas into money.
Correct.
And the suggestion is what we've been pretty good at in Canada, and I think some of the programs that I recall working on, everything from the Foundation for Innovation, the Canada Research Chairs, the granting councils, graduates, all of the things that we did certainly during the Chrétien government, did a lot to contribute to that invention phase.
Correct.
We're putting money into R&D. We see the pretty high performance of public sector spending on R&D, both through universities and colleges as well as through government labs.
We ranked 9th out of 34 OECD countries in terms of government investment in R&D. So that is a point of pride. The challenge is the fact that the private sector ranks 22 out of 34, and that's where the mismatch is.
So how do you begin to address that? What are the tools that you've got in your toolkit that can begin to challenge that problem?
So that is the key issue. I mean, there's so many different ways of measuring innovation, but one key metric that comes up is looking at research and development. But to your point, it's not looking at R&D in the context of simply looking at basic research, but how do you commercialize that? How do you actually find a solution that actually is viable, that can go in the market, that can help generate revenue and make money and grow companies? And so, we are looking at different programs. One area that you and I talked about at the World Economic Forum was procurement. And really looking at government procurement of how to help companies scale up and grow. We have an enormous opportunity if we do it strategically and thoughtfully and consistent with international trade obligations as well. We don't want to say buy Canada. It's really about focusing on those innovative companies and helping them scale up. The other area we're looking at is a cluster strategy. So we're very clear that we want to avoid the peanut butter approach, which is to say that we want to be very strategic and thoughtful and identify 2, maybe 3 to 5 clusters in Canada that can be global centers of excellence. And the reason why this is important is it really creates that kind of ecosystem that allows companies to work very closely with academia, with the supplier base, with the different levels of government, with key technologies, to continually look at how can they grow, how can they make those investments. It creates that environment to make those investments. And so we've allocated $800 million in our cluster and network strategy. But it's not simply just the allocation of that money. Then how do we connect it to the whole of government approach? So for instance, we're investing $120 billion in infrastructure. How do we connect that infrastructure money to that cluster strategy? So Mayor John Tory talks about the Toronto-Waterloo corridor, for example. So how can we use infrastructure money as well to complement the money that we would be investing? Obviously looking at procurement, as I talked to you about, but how do we also look at, for example, the fact that we're building ships or we're going to acquire planes, and we have an industrial technological benefit program. So how do we connect that to our clusters? So it's looking at creating a more comprehensive whole of government approach of creating an environment where if you're a business and you have ideas and you want to be able to compete globally, and you realize you have to think local, but you want to compete globally, you create an environment where you have these government programs, where you have private sector anchor companies also involved, we have different levels of government involved, and it changes the mindset for you to make that investment in R&D. So hopefully that'll spur some more investment, not only in R&D, but the commercialization side of it, which is very important.
You know, Tom also, in his talk this morning, referred back to some of the studies that have been done in the past. The Wilson Report,
Correct.
Commissioned by the Martin government, delivered to the Harper government, regrettably right in the midst of the financial crisis, so it kind of got put aside. His own Jenkins report,
Correct.
Recently reviewed by Andrei Solzenko, he was my ADM policy when I was in your job. Both of them pointing out that there are some regulatory barriers to fuller competition in some sectors in Canada. That falls largely under your responsibility.
Correct.
Have you been thinking about how are we going to increase competition in some key sectors in order to be able to generate innovation in those sectors?
Absolutely. Competition is so critical to create that environment where people are taking risk, where people understand that in order to succeed, they need to do better than the other individual or other company. One of the areas we looked at is in Canada, because we are pursuing free trade agreements. We're looking at CETA, for example, which is very important. Obviously, we're in the process under the TPP as well, and there's some other bilateral initiatives that we're pursuing. And one of the areas that kind of didn't receive a lot of attention, but I think is a very important initiative, is the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which deals with regulatory alignment, which deals with eliminating barriers, reducing barriers, looking at how to realign our regulations in Canada to make it easier for businesses to compete, to do business in other jurisdictions. And so this is something we're working very closely with the provinces and territories. We have an agreement in principle that was mentioned by the premiers at their last meeting. And we look forward to, in the coming weeks and months, ratifying that and making public the details of it. And so I think that is one clear example of how in Canada we're trying to create an environment that promotes competition amongst within Canada. Because we do not want a scenario, if we have a free trade agreement with Europe, where a European company has better access to Canadian procurement than a Canadian company does. And so we actively want to avoid a situation like that. And so we think that agreement speaks to some of the work that we're doing around regulatory alignment, on creating more competition and better opportunities for companies to grow.
Free trade within Canada?
Who would have thought of it?
What a novel idea.
I think post NAFTA, you started something called Agreement on Internal Trade, and I think pre-CETA being ratified, we want to bring in the Canada Free Trade Agreement. So I think hopefully we can close the loop on that very important initiative.
Yeah, it's a more elegant phrase. I actually started calling it infernal trade. It was such a frustrating experience. But anyway, let's go back. You started with the talent question. It's come up a number of times already this morning from various points of view, including inclusiveness of Indigenous peoples as part of the talent stream. What's your thinking? What's coming out of that consultation?
So, I mean, it's all about lifelong learning and continuous learning and the role of government and how we can work with private sector to really invest in people. And this is a real big challenge for us, because if we don't do this right, our innovation agenda will fall apart, our growth agenda will fall apart, our economy will not grow as fast as it needs to. And we have many challenges that we're dealing with. In terms of an aging population, we have for the first time more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 15.
And what's the problem with that?
Nothing, but I think in order to maintain a certain quality of life, we need innovation and we need to invest in people. One of the areas that it came up is, from my perspective, I've got a bit of a bias. I've got two young girls, Nanki, who's 8, and Kirpa, who's 6, is the importance around coding and really focusing on coding as a national mission and saying, look, coding is just as important as reading and writing. And what role can the federal government play in conjunction with the provinces and territories of creating investments in coding? But then if you look at a whole other suite of ideas, there has been a lot of emphasis on work integrated learning as well. I was at the Waterloo Summit talking about what I heard from Canadians around the innovation agenda. How do we build on a co-op model like that? How do we focus on apprenticeships and more co-ops? How do we create more work integrated learning? Because it's important for the students because they obviously go to the workforce and apply what they learn in the class, but they bring those thoughts and ideas back into the classroom as well, which adds value to the curriculum. So there's an enormous amount of credit there as well. But then also ICT adoption and digital literacy as well as for companies as well that want to scale up and grow. So I would say that those are some examples around the talent. But the other one that doesn't get talked about often, which I think is very important, is immigration. I think yes, in Canada, we say diversity is our strength. I think we take enormous pride in the fact that we have a multicultural society. I think the fact that we started off this conversation talking about my turban color speaks to the fact that there's a level of comfort in the public sphere to have these conversations. But the honest truth is there's still reluctancy around immigration policy. When we want to talk about immigration and we say we want to bring more immigrants in because it's good for the economy, we still get pushback. You get pushback when you see this in different surveys, we see this in different conversations. I think what we need to do as a government needs to do a better job of explaining that more immigration creates more jobs. And I think the challenge is people see immigration, they will take away our jobs. And that conversation is a tough one to have, but I think there's enormous potential if we have a global talent visa, for example, post-Brexit and what's happening in the US, take advantage of the top talent around the world that is looking to Canada and bringing them here. And again, making that part of our cluster strategy. So when I was talking about those clusters, if we invest in talent, then we want to put them in an environment where they have the opportunity to test out ideas, start a company, and grow that company. So everything is connected. So that whole of government approach, whole of society approach is also very important. But I would say immigration is a key part of talent, the talent equation. And I need your help and the help of many in this room to change that conversation. Because I can tell you I'm hitting a bit of a challenge within government and having this conversation because there is this hesitation of, well, maybe immigration might be viewed negatively because we still have reasonably high unemployment in certain parts of the country. And overall, how do we explain it to Canadians because they'll view it as someone taking away their jobs? So I think we need to change the conversation and say it's not a social policy, it's economic policy. It's important to our economic agenda, our innovation agenda. If we bring the right people, the motivated people, they'll create more jobs and more opportunities for Canadians.
I think there are many really strong illustrative anecdotes that make that point for you. And you're sitting.
Well, my dad came to this
dad.
country, $7 in his pocket. Obviously, at the beginning, worked 3 jobs, but then eventually started his own company, which hired 20 people. So I've seen it firsthand. When you have people who are motivated, who want to become entrepreneurs, who create opportunities not only for themselves, but for others as well. And I think that's something we need to explain and we need to talk more about.
The chair of the Business Council of Canada, Linda Hassenfratz, her father
Yes.
arrived here, similar story, came from Hungary, had $10 in his pocket, started a business in his house, which is now a global enterprise.
This is a Canadian story.
Here in Ottawa, Terry Matthews
That's right.
in Canada, which is really the hotbed of innovation in this region, arrived as an immigrant from the United Kingdom. And the stories go on and on. I think that the stories aren't that hard to find.
No, and I think we need to highlight them more. We need to brag about them more. And that needs to be part of the narrative we talk to and engage with Canadians and explain to them that immigration policy is a good thing. It's a competitive advantage. It's how we're genuinely going to grow, maintain a good quality of life, and create good jobs for future generations. I talk to people about immigration in the context of my girls having better opportunities and better opportunities for employment, et cetera. So I think we have to change that conversation.
By the way, wait till your girls are teenagers.
Oh boy.
They only speak in code. You don't have to worry about the code thing. That's going to be taken. That'll take care of itself.
Thanks for the advice.
Let's just take, before we go back to Mark and go to the floor for questions, let's just pursue a little bit on the cluster strategy, because we've talked about this in the past, but we have, I think, tended, in typical Canadian fashion, to take what you described as the peanut butter approach. And by the way, it's not the crunchy peanut butter, it's the smooth, so that it's really,
Spread out.
let's make sure that every piece, every corner of the toast gets its share, right?
That's right.
Because we want to make sure we're, above all else, fair to everyone. And yet, as Victor Dodig said, sitting up here this morning, he said, the Canadian economy, when you look at the gross numbers, it's natural resources, financial services, and real estate. That's a big portion of the economy. How do we, while we're trying to build new industries and find new things that we're best in the world at, how do we play to our strengths in sectors in which we're already strong? And does the cluster strategy, will it reflect that?
Absolutely. We have to work off of a solid foundation that we have. We can't neglect our strengths. We have to work off of those strengths. So it would be looking at wherever we have, a geography, a group of people where we have critical mass. That's important. We have to look at enabling technology. So technology that's prevalent in all industries and all sectors. So, for example, is it big data? Is it artificial intelligence? Is it quantum? Is it nano? I mean, there are just so many possibilities that exist in these different types of technologies that exist that will help different sectors. So how do we really create an environment to really unlock some of the potential in those areas? Then also looking at, life sciences or agriculture, or looking at aerospace or autos, wherever they may exist. But it's not for government to decide. What we want to do is create an environment, right, where we're saying we're only going to pick 3 to 5. We want the 3 to 5 best ideas to emerge. So we're going to create a consortia and say, who can go out there and really have an anchor firm or 2 firms, really connect the supply chain and SME base, really focus on a couple of key sectors, really focus on enabling technology, work with different levels of government, and come forward with an idea. And then our job is to connect the infrastructure piece, the ITB policy that we have, the industrial technological benefits that we provide, looking at procurement, looking at immigration, and then make that part of that. That's our role. So that's our role. We're not there to decide this technology or this sector. So it really is a genuine partnership. We're willing to put money at the table, and we're willing to allocate government resources in a strategic way. But to your point, starting from scratch makes no sense. We have to work off of our strengths, and I think that will be reflected in the proposals that we receive.
Well, and also, just drawing on my own experience, when I would ask the department, what are the key new technology sectors? Now, granted, we're looking back a few years, but still, they were many of the same ones.
That's right.
And then you'd say, well, are any other countries doing this kind of exercise?
That's right.
Yes, they are. And you'd say, well, what are their sectors?
Correct.
And then you would find that everybody's kind of chasing some of the same things.
Well, we have to be thoughtful. We have to find the niches. We have to find what we can really be good at globally. Maybe when it comes to nanotechnology, there's other jurisdictions like Japan, for example, and the US that are ahead of us. But maybe within that, there's an area where we can really focus on materials, for example, and really accelerate. Same thing with quantum. I was with D-Wave in Burnaby, for example, and they now have a computer. And looking at maybe they might not necessarily really see the full potential of quantum, but they're starting to see some of it. So how can we help accelerate that? So we have to be very thoughtful, very strategic, and find where our niches are, because you're absolutely right. If we replicate other jurisdictions, how do we differentiate ourselves? What is the value proposition that we have? And how do we really create robust growth? And I think we have to recognize that we are a country of 35 million people, and sometimes dealing with a China, India, or the US or the Europe, we cannot compete at the same level in terms of funding, but we can be very, very strategic.
Mark, do you want to go to the floor for some questions?
Very happy to, and obviously thank you on behalf of everybody. It's a very rich conversation, and rarely do we have an opportunity to continue that conversation with your participation. So please, there are some microphones, obviously, and we can do it through Twitter. And I'll actually ask a question which is off of the Twitter feed. And it's around, does government have the right policy instruments, the right tools to propel innovation against your objectives today? The government has made a considerable investment in the notion of the delivery of a whole set of new outcomes. Do you also have now to innovate in terms of the instruments that you have at your disposal to actually achieve the innovation agenda?
So, Minister of Finance is not in the room, but I obviously would say that we're always looking for additional instruments, more tools in the toolbox to further that agenda, and that's a conversation that we've had with Canadians, and we'll be making those proposals to Cabinet and hopefully should be reflected in the next budget. But we have quite a few tools, and more importantly, if you look at the last budget, we made a significant down payment on the innovation agenda. We committed to $2 billion for strategic investments in our post-secondary institutions. Leverage with the provinces and territories, that's $4 billion. And so that really upped our game on creating the infrastructure that we needed. Then we also focused on $900 million investment for not only the infrastructure, but investing directly in our researchers through the Canada Research Fund, which was very significant. And again, we selected 13 areas. So we were very thoughtful. It wasn't the peanut butter approach. It had, again, a bit of focus to that as well. We also put forward a broadband connectivity initiative of $500 million. We invested in the Canadian Space Agency. So we have different programs, different policies that in place that I think will help advance the agenda. But this is a question I actually may, if you don't mind, ask John, because this is a challenge that I think I will face, and there's something that does preoccupy me, which is we can have all the strategies, we can have all the policies, we can have all the programs. The key issue that I find is on the implementation. How do we implement it and how do we measure it? So it's really focusing on the challenges around implementation when you're dealing with with so many different departments, as we're taking a whole of government approach. How would you engage other departments in a meaningful way? And then how does it fit to metrics and accountability and deliverology, as this government has talked about? I think that is an area where we need to really also focus on. It's not simply about having the right policies and programs, but implementation is key, and I'd like to hear just John's views from that.
Well, I think that's exactly the right thing to focus on, and I think it's also important to remember when we're talking about innovation in the Canadian economy, it's not all about the government. Correct. It's actually only a part of it about the government.
That's right.
And one of the things that you have to consider if you want to look at things through an innovation lens is, are you creating obstacles to innovation rather than, over here, when over on the other side, you're actually trying to, wear the hat that says make Canada innovative again.
Yes.
We've talked about some of these before. Is a tax policy strategy that rewards firms for being small a good growth strategy?
Probably
is
not.
One that says as soon as a early stage technology company needing additional capital does an IPO and therefore loses the refundability of its ITCs. Correct. Is that an obstacle or an enabler to innovation? Immigration, a big one. If a firm is on a high growth strategy, we're not talking about the 200 and some thousand immigrants that come into Canada. We're talking about company A that needs, special talent X. Correct. To come in and solve problems. Not sometime next year,
within
but
the next few
sometime
weeks.
in a short time, because I think, when I think of my time in your job, what you're facing is a speed of change that is much, much greater than what I confronted. And we're good at saying the world needs more Canada, and it does. But the world's not going to wait for Canada. So we've got to just, put the bit in our teeth and get on with it and try to evaluate what we're doing according to whether it's getting the outcomes we want.
Yeah.
Okay, we have three questions from the floor, and I think that will be about the time that we have allotted. And I'm just going to go by microphone 1, 2, and then 3. Please state who you are and who your question is intended for.
Thank you. It's Bob Masterson with the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada.
I can-
A question for Minister Bains.
Okay.
Minister Bains, we're here today talking about getting beyond 2%. And globally, the chemistry sector is growing faster than global GDP. We talked a bit about innovation this morning. There's been a lot of innovation in the energy sector. Over the last 5 years, we've seen more than $300 billion of new investments in the U.S. chemical sector alone. Just to put that in perspective, historically, Canada's attracted 10% of investment in that sector. We should have seen about $30 billion of new investment in chemistry in Canada. We've seen less than 3. We have a major problem attracting global capital, and I'd like to hear from you, what is the government going to do? We talked about it this morning. We have to attract global capital. Big companies matter. What is it that Canada can and will do to attract global capital? Thank you.
So thank you for that question, and I think the Prime Minister is really leading the charge on this. He's out there talking about the fact that Canada is open for business, and I can tell you right now we're looking at the Investment Canada Act and looking at that as a means to really send a clear signal that we are open for business, to reflect again the missed opportunities in the chemical sector, but also across the board. How do we also look at streamlining government programs, retooling government programs to look at how do we make investments to bring, what role can government play to bring those investments to Canada? So not only looking at the Investment Canada Act, but looking at other government programs that are not only focused on aero or auto or life science, but much broader to look at the whole spectrum of different opportunities that are presented to themselves. So we want to be sure that we have a much more broader, comprehensive approach to looking at investment as well. So we're really looking at government programming, and the Investment Canada Act as 2 examples of how to deal with that issue, and that's very important because we want the investment, but we also want that investment in research and development as well, going back to the earlier point as well. So we want head offices here. We want the best talent in this country so we can get the good quality jobs, and we want the research and development in Canada as well. So part of our approach is also looking at companies when we get mandates or when we get investments, is how do we get some of that research and development money in Canada as well, because it's so critical to our innovation agenda.
Okay, thank you. Microphone number 2, please.
Good morning, Minister. This is Kelly Hutchinson from ITAC, and happy to hear the dialogue is continuing from Mexico, so appreciate that. My question really is around a comment that Mr. Jenkins made earlier around the importance of large firms and getting innovative small firms into the global supply chain. Jurisdictions have done a lot to invest and encourage collaborative and promote collaborative innovation. And our question today is really around, is this something that Canada is going to be investing in and promoting in Canada's innovation agenda?
So if I understand correctly, what is our focus on growing companies? What are we doing?
On collaborative innovation.
So I think our approach so far demonstrates our desire to collaborate. I think it's really the new kind of culture and tone of this government. If we look at the Prime Minister, of how we work with our provincial and territorial counterparts, how we work with our international partners, how we work with industry and civil society and academia. We recognize, and as John has so rightly put, government plays a role, but it's only got the small slice of the pie. That really requires a whole of society approach. Everyone needs to work together. So our job is, how can we convene? How can we create an opportunity for that collaboration to take place? And as I illustrated in my remarks earlier about, for example, clusters and networks, that's one example of how we can genuinely focus on, how do we engage our Indigenous population, our youth, more women, how do we connect new Canadians, how do we look at civil society, things that haven't been discussed in the innovation agenda before, because in the past it was always about productivity and competitiveness. Now it's about quality of life, finding solutions to problems. So how do we deal with an aging population and looking at mission-driven initiatives? So this is one area we're looking at. Can we create something like in Canada, like a DARPA, they have in the US, an ARPA-E, focus on climate change and how do we achieve those ambitious targets? Or how do we deal with an aging population? Or how do we deal with challenges in the north? So I think those are examples of our ability to expand, first of all, what innovation is about. Secondly, to create an environment for collaboration, to have those discussions and really focus on solutions in those areas.
That's fantastic. And anything that the government can do to really encourage and foster those alliances within private industry would be fantastic.
I think that's a value add for government. I think that's what we do well. And I think that's where we're going to continue to focus our efforts on.
Great, thank you.
All right. Now, I'm afraid that we're about to be outranked in our system. There are very few people more important than a minister of the Crown, but His Excellency, the Governor General, is one of them. And I'm afraid that he is next. So perhaps question number 3 could come to the hallway.
You can have
and perhaps there's an opportunity there. So anyway, listen, thank everyone, please, to round of applause for the panel.